important thing about this study was that it came out right during the big bye-bye enthusiastic movement. And it showed, it was the first study that we could really use to show that ASL was not the first language of all deaf children. I mean, these people clearly documented that these kids had been raised on C. Their English was very complex, age appropriate, they read well, and ASL was not their first language. And that might be something that we take for granted now, but it was a gift to the field at the time because so many people believed that ASL was the first language of all deaf children. And you know, a lot of people still believe that. I told a story the other day that happened to me at Statewide here in Texas a number of years ago. One of the speakers, there was a panel of us, and we were each representing different languages and systems on this panel, and we were speaking for a large group of people. And one of the people from the Learning Center, which is one of the predominant ASL programs in the country and still is, accused me in front of all these people of oppressing Mary Pat and Marcy because I wasn't allowing them to use ASL. And as I said the other day, you know, I'm a child of the 60s. To know that I'm oppressing anybody is really difficult for me to take. I said to her, well, it's a good thing Marcy got to come to America then, isn't it? Because what would she have done with ASL in Bulgaria? And it just kind of broke the tension, and the whole audience laughed, and it just sort of pointed out that you are not born signing ASL, just like none of you were born speaking English. You have to be around people that use the language. And if we provide our children access to English on our hands, they will learn English. And you know, from the Rhodes Scholar article that's over there, to mingling with my kids, to mingling with many of the children that you could bring to a conference like this or a workshop like this, we know that our kids can acquire English well through C2. So this was, you know, again, a piece of research that was just such a gift to the field. Okay, well, I'd like to show you a little bit more work that Mary Pat Moeller and I did together. We wanted to study some parents in her program up there in Omaha who were the parents of 3- and 4-year-old children in the preschool program. And this was the basic design of our study. We videotaped these parents in playing with their children using a Fisher-Price Castle. We always used this same toy. It was kind of a unique toy that the kids excuse me, hadn't seen. And we just videotaped the parents a couple times to get an idea of how they were signing before we did anything. And then we did a first intervention. And what we did is we let them, after this baseline, we talked with them. We had already transcribed what they had signed and said, and we talked with them each individually and showed them their transcripts, showed them where they were leaving out words. We worked with them to set goals in use, meaning, and form, which is what is shown here, use, meaning, and form goals, to see if they could improve their ability to sign to these children. And then we did that once, and we took data, we did it again, and then there was a summer period of time that we called the retention videotape, where we hadn't seen them for quite a long time over the summer, and we videotaped them again to see if in fact they retained those goals that they had set for themselves. So this paper is just the design of the study, it's not the results. And again, there's a lot of information here. I'm just going to show you just a couple of these to point out a couple of results I think we can learn from this work. Okay, this is a graph of the changes for all the subjects in the consistency with which they sign C2. Now, you can see that this subject started off signing C2 between 80 and 100% of the time, or 80 and a high 90% of the time. She was a very good signer even before we got involved. And she just pretty much maintained her skills. This parent down here was another mother who, following Marmoro and Petito, signed about 10% of what she was saying to her child. And she was able, through this intervention, to improve quite a bit. She improved up between 60 and 70%. And then everybody else kind of fell in there someplace in between. And even in that period of retention, they were able to retain what they had decided to work on as in terms of form and meaning skills. One of the things that we use a lot in our work is called mean length utterance. Mean length utterance, and it's really basically a gross estimate of how long your utterance is. Like mine this morning might be between like 10 and 12 words, for example. And one of the things that we found out in our study was that many of these parents were signing below the MLU, the mean length utterance, of their own children. So if the child was about here, they were signing beneath the language length of what their child was signing. And that is not a good situation for language development. You need to know where the children are at, and you need to be a little bit above that. And that's how we learn language. And that's why we all use developmental language curriculums and things like that, so that we kind of know where we're going here. I often use this example of, I can about order beer in Spanish. And if I listen to the Spanish radio station when I'm down here, I can't acquire Spanish from that because it's too high above where my level is. So you have to be right down near it, but it's important to be above. And we found that our students were really input -1 instead of input +1. So one of the findings of this study was that parents who were in that situation improved on the length of what they were saying to not way too high, but just enough so that they were above the MLU of their own children. Now, an important finding of this study, there's actually 2 studies that were written up, one in the JSHD Journal for Speech that I mentioned earlier, and another one in the American Annals of the Deaf. And the important thing about those studies, which are on page 3 of your handout, is really, I think, that, first of all, we don't have to continue to sign fossilized sign, where we just sign the way that we sign forever. We can change the way that we sign as adults. So this was a study that was actually focused on adults and not children. And these were parents, but we can use these same tools to focus on interpreters and teachers in our programs. And there's a lot to be said, as we just have discussed in our class here, for videotaping yourself, setting goals, and then videotaping later and seeing how you're doing. It doesn't have to be as sophisticated as this work, but we need to figure out ways to monitor our signing. And if you've got a principal or a supervisor that couldn't sign their way out of a paper bag, then you have to figure out how to do it yourself. And I think there's a lot to be learned here for that. I mean, it's been documented that we all do better if we're being evaluated, even if we're evaluating ourselves. So that was the Moeller and study with me. Okay, the next study I'd like to share with you is a study that really I found quite humorous, and it was one of 3 studies that I did with regard to whether the rules of English could be followed by or rules of sign systems could be followed by people who purported to use them. In this study, I had a number of different groups of people that used either C or Signed English or PSE. And you can see here that they had been signing for a number of years. Another theme that's very important in the work that I've done is the number of years that you've been signing has nothing to do with your proficiency. And often the people who've been signing the longest are the people in these signed English or PSE groups, and yet we can show information where we are actually signing more consistently. Now I know this is going to be really small, but just as an example, this is some of the information from my 1988 study, and here's this group that was signing exact English and all the complete inputs, and they had taught for about 8 years. The people that were signing signed English and PSE had been signing for about 10 years. And these people had been teaching for 8 years and 10 years, and these people had been signing for 7 years and 11 years. And yet, you know, that just didn't matter in terms of how well the children were doing. In fact, one of the interesting things that came out of this was that here, the MLU, the length of what they were using when they talked to children in preschool in this group A was almost 5 words or 5 morphemes per sentence, and then it continued to get a little bigger. Like here's the elementary was almost 6 words, and the high school they were signing about 7 words. You compare that over here to the PSE and signed English people, and they were pretty much just always signing about the same amount. Even what they were signing at high school was not as lengthy as what the Group A people were signing in preschool. So it's good to be able to, you know, have some ways of illustrating some of these dilemmas. But anyway, this is what I did in this study. Now I know you won't be able to read this. I just want to show you this, just kind of as a visual. There were 25 sentences. I put them on audio tape, and I designed these sentences very carefully. Here's all my little things that I thought about. And these sentences contained all the things that I knew were difficult for us as signers. They contained the do verb, they contained pronouns, they contained contractions, they contained novel vocabulary that I knew there wasn't signs for. They contained a lot of figurative English that's in our language. And people would listen to these sentences over an audio tape and then individually sign them into a camera. So the camera, when I had the videotape back, there was no sound on the videotape because that was all done through this Walkman that they listened to. And they would hear each sentence twice, and then they were instructed to sign it on the videotape. So, let's see. The subjects transcribed 25 sentences without the audio that they had signed themselves about 2 years earlier. So I sent the videotapes back to everybody, and I said, would you write down what you had signed 2 years ago? I figured, like me, they were probably senile and they couldn't remember, and they just had to go by their own signing. And this was during a time when everybody was really critical of sign models on videotape, so I figured if they had to transcribe themselves, they wouldn't complain because it was them. So that worked pretty good, actually. So then I analyzed their written transcripts of what they signed for form, grammar, and meaning, and then I looked at those features. And there was a lot of interesting things that came out of that work. And one of the most important was that the people who signed C could write down exactly what they said. I mean, you know, just like you can just imagine. And the people that signed PSE had a lot more difficulty. So I wanted to share just a couple of these with you. Here's one example of all the people who, in terms of being able to transcribe figurative expressions like time is fleeting or hold your horses or something like that. The C people could do that 95% of the time. And the signed English people 71% of the time, and the PSE people 23% of the time. Here's some examples of time is fleeting from the PSE people. Now, just to give you an example of this, if you've signed time, which was one way that some PSE people did that, time is fleeting, you can just imagine that 2 years later it'd be pretty tricky to figure out what that was supposed to be. And so Some of these examples contain the meaning, and some of them don't mean the same thing at all. But that really isn't the important message of this work. What I was trying to get at was, just because you have it in your head and you know that you're thinking, I better hurry because time is fleeting, how do you know that the students are getting that from what you're signing? How do you know that they're getting the grammar or the meaning of English just because you're thinking it? And so I really think, although some of the results are humorous, that is really the important result here. However, I can't pass the opportunity to share some of the results. Now again, these will be small, but I'll read them to you. Okay, she works like, oops, where's my favorite one here? Okay, he eats like a horse too. Now, this person wrote down he eats like a rabbit. That's kind of understandable because, you know, they just articulated the wrong way. They got their horse and their rabbit mixed up, and we do stuff like that. But I think a more interesting one is he eats the same horse too. Now, not only does it hardly make any sense, which you would think they would try to fix that up, but more importantly, you know how we always get laughed at for how we sign like. I'm sure it's happened to every person in this room. And most people sign either he eats like a horse, or they sign he eats like a horse. So this person obviously signed he eats, well, it looks like they signed he eats like a horse. And so guess what happened? When they went back to transcribe that, they got he eats the same horse. So even though people laugh at us for signing that way, we clearly have the more apparent way of writing English, even for people who don't believe in our way of signing. Their toys seem to scatter themselves was the target here. I'll just do a couple of these, don't get worried. Here the person wrote down, it seems to be all over. Now, this is the kind of thing that started me thinking that even the meaning of what people, you know, they always say, well, the meaning of Pigeon Signed English or case is so much clearer. Well, is it really? And of course, my work is all based on that Bloom and Leahy taxonomy, which some people would say, well, you know, maybe that's not a very good taxonomy. But I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that the meaning doesn't match up real well here. Okay, this person said there are toy mirrors for them to look at themselves. Now, why did they do that? Seams and mirrors. So when you sign those signs today, just remember that. Okay, and then this person even got the wrong kind of there, which is interesting, and that talks a lot about the pronouns that we use in our system and that type of thing. And then toys mixed up yourself. It's like, what does that even mean? Okay, and this type of thing, you know, that type of thing goes through the whole set of these sentences, that if you were interested, you could go through and look at, well, how did we do on do verbs, and how did we do on pronouns? And there's problems just all the way through. Now, I've taken this methodology, and actually there's, again, Marianne Moorman here in Texas. She's now a supervisor. Marianne Moorman, and she is a special ed director now in Greenville. She did a version of this. She thought my sentences were too weird. So she did a group of sentences like this that were much more typical of what you would find around the school. And using this methodology, what I started to do is I started to videotape whole programs of teachers and then share the results with them, and then I could say to them, you are really good on your do verb. When you come to do, didn't, doesn't, did, you all sign it the same way. However, you have some problems here with your figurative English. You need to figure out what you're going to do and do it. Or when you come to a word that there's no sign for, some people are inventing a sign, some people are finger spelling. You know, you need to have a strategy. You need to discuss a strategy. So it became a very quick way of looking at consistency, and that's what Marianne used it for too. She used the same methodology, but changed it just so that she thought the sentences were not so contrived. that was a good thing. Okay. I've said most of the things I want to say in conclusion to that set of work, except that one thing, figurative English is very, very important. There is no way you could begin to ever teach specifically all the figurative English that's in English. And you can pick up the most elementary book, like the Bernstein Bears, any book for preschoolers, and you will be faced with this problem of figurative English. Now, those of you that are like my age or older, you remember the Dormack series of like Keep Your Nose to the Grindstone, and we were all supposed to do one of those every day. Well, you'd be like teaching until you were about 120, and you still wouldn't get through them all. So why not just do it the way we all learned? We all learned figures of speech because people used them with us. And if that little eyes glazed over, somebody say, cut it out, then they'd say, the glazed over look, they'd say, stop it, cut it out. And that's how we all learn figurative English. Now, I say this never really goes over quite the way I intended, but I think if you think it through, the only reason that you would translate every single one of those is your assumption would be that deaf kids are too dumb to understand them. Because if you learned them, then they must be able to learn them. If they're just as smart as we are, then why wouldn't they be able to learn figures of speech like we learned them? And if you think you have to change them all, then you must be, you really need to think, why do I think that? So I would challenge you to do that. Okay, the next study I'd like to talk about is another study that I did with regards to PSE. And this time I decided to, here, let me just check one thing on the handout here. It's on page 2, and it's called Liedtke-Stahlmann 1993, 3 PSE Studies. And I've talked about 2 of those studies, and now I'm going to be working on study 3. This was a really interesting study for me. I had just been to the Deaf Club for about the umpteenth time in which somebody was ridiculing how we sign this word run. And I was thinking, yes, we do sign run differently. That's why it's English. I mean, that's how English works. You have a lot of words and you use them for multiple meanings, and that's English. And so I decided to set up a study around the word run. And so it was called Adults' Ability to Transcribe the Multiple Meanings of Run in Context, given 2 models. And what I did is I had 38 hearing adults, all of whom had 8 or more years of experience signing PSE, and they all considered themselves to be experts. Now, I live in Kansas City. There are 10,000 deaf adults. There's a Gallaudet Regional Center. There's my program. There's the Kansas School for the Deaf. There's an interpreter training program. So there are a lot of hearing people around who are very skilled signers. 40% of the people were CODAs. Okay, and I randomly divided them into 2 groups. So we'll just call that Group A and Group B. And not to get real technical here, but I set up the study so that the different groups got different stories at different times, and so that was all controlled. So if one story was a little bit easier, then the groups flipped and another group got that first or second. So the order was controlled. And the stories were equal stories. One of the stories was signed in C, and the other story was signed in PSE. So professionals signed each story on videotape. There were no significant differences between the versions of the stories with regard to form and content. And I have one of the stories. I'll just read a little bit to you. These are stories that Jerry Lee, I think, or maybe Esther wrote. When I left work today, I had no trouble getting to my van started. It runs fine since the tune-up. But then I ran into trouble with the runoffs from yesterday's rain. Would you believe that by the time the other vehicles got through the flooded area, I had run out of gas? Then I was in such a hurry to get to an in-service that I ran a red light and got ticketed. So you can see that there's a lot of different uses of run, but it's within context. The story makes sense. And again, I looked at adults' abilities to transcribe these sentences. And these first two, oh no, this is it, okay. So there was a trend for subjects to do better on the second story because they saw two stories, one in PSE and then one in English, or one in C2 and then one in PSE. It just depended. But they always did better on the second story because the second stories were highly similar. Okay, the subjects were able to transcribe the form of the C2 subjects, the subjects were able to transcribe the form of the C2 stories significantly more accurately than they were able to transcribe the form of the PSE stories. Okay, so even though none of these people knew C2, but they were hearing, they had an English language base, and they did better in the C2 stories than they did in the PSE stories. And again, it would be that same reason, that same type of thing where, you know, you're getting this like time fleeting and you're supposed to write down what it means. And so when they were able to do that in C, they did better. That is, they could retrieve the grammar and the syntax of English more proficiently using English, C2, than PSE. Okay? This is not an unexpected result given that PSE does not utilize a rich, mature grammar. You know, PSE is like a combination of English and ASL, so it doesn't have a rich, mature grammar, and it doesn't have the syntax of either ASL or English. Okay, the subjects were able to transcribe the meaning of the C2 stories significantly more than they were able to transcribe the meaning of the PSE stories. Okay. Okay, so all in all, in the results of the PSE studies that I did, and I think this is important because PSE is so used in this country that I think it's time that we stand up and say, you know, pick ASL, pick English, but don't pick PSE or contact language or C signed English, any conceptual form. So the summary of these three studies was that PSE is a contact language. It functions as a vehicle of communication.